This is lesson number 19 in our study of the Old Testament history as we're studying the history of the Hebrew family. We finished the book of Genesis. It took 18 lessons to get through the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is probably the most important book in all the Bible. It lays the foundation for everything that will occur. It is indeed the book of beginnings. It is the beginning of creation. It is the beginning of sin. It is the beginning of redemption. It's the beginning of covenant. All things that the Bible will discuss introduced in the book of Genesis. Now we change to the book of Exodus. The word Exodus, of course, means a departure, going out. It looks forward to the time that the children of Israel leave the land of Egypt. When we close the book of Genesis, they were in the land of Egypt in peace and prosperity because Joseph, the double-portioned firstborn of Jacob, was the prime minister, the ruler, the governor of all of Egypt, and therefore of all the world. Before we get into the book of Exodus with the story of the oppression and the exodus from that oppression, let's think for a moment about the country and the territory of Egypt. Egypt is a very, very important land in the Old Testament times. So much so that in the study of archaeology, the digging up of ancient ruins, there's a separate science called Egyptology, as people have studied through the centuries this nation to see how it relates to the people of God, how the people of God relate to it, and therefore to give us even a better understanding of the Word of God. If you don't have an outline, make sure you obtain one, either from the sponsor of this program or from us. We'll be glad to see that you get an outline so you can follow along lesson by lesson and point by point. Let's look at the land of captivity on your outline, especially the names of the land to start with. Although it's not found in the Bible, on many ancient monuments, this land is called Kem, K-E-M. Perhaps that was the name used by the natives, what they would call that land. It's also called in the Psalms on several occasions the land of Ham, for they descend from the people of Egypt, descend from Noah's son Ham. Every time you see Egypt in your Old Testament, it's the Hebrew word Mizraim, M-I-Z-R-A-I-M. He was a son of Ham and the father of all of the Egyptian people. So this word is found nearly 100 times in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament and always translated in our text, Egypt. 2 or 3 times in the Psalms, Egypt is called Rahab, not because of the Canaanite spy in the city of Jericho, but because Rahab means the exalted one, or really the haughty one, the insolent one, the proud one, and that's the way Egypt was. The word Egypt that we have in our translation is the Greek name for this nation, and is really not known until nearly the New Testament times, and that's a word that means divided. And that's because when the Nile gets up to Lower Egypt, where it becomes 3 tributaries and forms what we call the Delta. 2 divisions of the land. Those are the names of the land. Now let's call Egypt, that is divided. Egypt is always discussed in 2 categories topographically. There's Lower Egypt, and this gets confusing sometimes, because you see Egypt is the Nile. And so the lower part of the Nile is up on the map since the Nile flows north. So Lower Egypt is the delta, formed by the 3 tributaries or the 3 divisions of the river as it enters that flat tableland just before it goes into the Mediterranean Sea. This is the triangular delta of the Nile. Now Upper Egypt, which is down on the map because it's southern Egypt, is a narrow valley, varying in width from 2 to 10 miles as it follows the course of the Nile. This is the fertile part of Egypt, and the only part of Egypt that is suitable for permanent habitation. Let's talk about some special features of this country. Egypt extends 675 miles from north to south and 500 miles from east to west. That's 500,000 square miles. But less than 5% of all that territory is suitable for permanent habitation, and less than that suitable to grow crops. The Nile is really Egypt. Without the Nile, Egypt would just be a part of the desert. The Nile River brings Africa's fertility, Central Africa's fertility, into Egypt and makes it a somewhat fertile place to live. The Nile has three sources. The lakes of northeastern and central Africa. There are three of them, and these are the sources of the Nile River. There are three tributaries: the Bairo, the Blue Nile, and the White Nile, or the Atbara, as it's called. From where these three, or the last of these three, enter the Nile to where it enters the Mediterranean is a distance of 1,500 miles, during which there are no other tributaries. There has to be a large volume of water already there for it to flow all the way to the sea without any other tributaries feeding it. One of the most interesting things about the Nile, still today, is the yearly overflow. The Nile will begin to overflow. Of course, it does so. It begins to swell down on the map in Upper Egypt. But as it gets to Lower Egypt, it will overflow because it gets out of that valley, out of that canyon it flows in, into a delta, plains type area. It begins about the 25th of June every year. It attains a height, this flood tide, attains a height of 36 feet above normal at Thebes and 25 feet above normal at Cairo. And Cairo is just below where the river divides. And then it spreads out over all this delta to a depth of 4 feet at the mouth and will stay that way for at least a month. This remarkable overflow is due to the heavy rains in Central Africa. No snow to melt, just heavy rains. And it brings down new soil and keeps the land fertile year after year after year. Today, of course, they've dammed up the river so they can control that overflow and use the water they believe more efficiently. But this is what made Egypt the powerful nation it was. And this is why in our last few lessons we could study the whole world coming to Egypt to buy grain when there was a 7-year drought and a 7-year famine in all the land. The Nile is an unusually effective and efficient tool. Then let's look briefly at the people. What kind of people lived here? What was their origin? Well, we studied that real early in our study. In Genesis chapter 10, we found out that they come from Ham, and particularly from his son Mizraim. These people are one of the earliest civilizations known. As far as I can find out, only the Sumerian civilization that we know about today is earlier than the Egyptian civilization. In religion, they were very, very religious people. They had splendid and highly ornamented temples. Their priests were skilled in the learning of their day, and they practiced magic, many mysterious rites. They had hundreds of gods, but they had one chief god. That chief god was Ra, sometimes it's pronounced Re, the sun god. He was immediately followed by a trinity, by a triad of high-ordered gods. Osiris, with his wife Isis, and their son Horus. Set, S-E-T, or Set, is the author of all evil in the Egyptian religion. He's the Egyptian Satan, with whom those four chief gods waged eternal warfare. The Egyptians, as far as I can find out in my study, did not worship images. They didn't bow before images and think those images were God. Various animals, however, such as bulls and dogs and cats and crocodiles and snakes and insects, and especially the beetle, the scarab, the scarabosus, were regarded with great reverence because they were thought to be not gods, but representative of the gods. And to kill them was a fearful sin. The Egyptians believed correctly in the immortality of the soul. And they believed that that soul would be one day reunited with the body. And as far as I'm concerned, that explains their practice of embalming the body. Since they couldn't believe because they had no revelation of that the body would be raised from the dead. They tried to preserve the body until such time as the soul could be reunited with it. They also believed in the day of judgment, when everybody would be rewarded according to his deeds. Osiris was the guardian of the dead, and he, with 42 other gods associated with him as judges, would at the day of judgment render absolute, perfect judgment to all people. They were by nature, so their religion was highly organized, had truth in it. You see, God had revealed himself in the past. This is Paul's argument in Romans 1. God had revealed himself in the past, and that revelation was never absolutely erased. Man knew, because of past revelation, about the character and the nature of God. The Egyptians, by nature, the Egyptian people, by nature, were very intelligent. You can tell that by their pyramids, the Sphinx, and all the ancient buildings that they had, and very progressive. They were above and beyond their day. They were kind, and they were hospitable to guests, although they felt superior. And they let everybody know that they felt superior. They treated their women with respect. Agriculture was a high honored profession. But all shepherding, whether it was of sheep or of goats or of cows or whatever, all shepherding was held in contempt. And the shepherd was thought to be one cursed by God. Now, we already talked about that as we studied Joseph's life. A quick three-point history of Egypt, and then we'll look at some cities, and then we'll get into the study of Exodus. History in Egypt is divided into three divisions: the early empire, the middle empire, and the new empire. The early empire is from 3500, as far back as we can trace, maybe even before then, 3500 BC to 2500 BC. That was before even Abraham went to Egypt. Their first king was a man named Menes, M-E-N-E-S. Their first capital was Memphis, very close to present-day Cairo. If you look on a modern map and locate Cairo, you're basically locating Memphis. That was the ancient capital. And during this 1,000 years or more, all life centered around Pharaoh. And it's during this time that word Pharaoh began to be used for the ruler of Egypt, as we've already discussed, but we'll do it again. The word Pharaoh means great house. And it was that house that ruled not just Egypt, but as far as they were concerned, all of the world. They thought themselves the mother empire, the mother of all other nations. And they believed all nations had come from this great house. And so whoever was sitting on the throne in that great house, as far as they were concerned, was the father of all the world. So during this 1,000 years, they not only centered their life around Pharaoh, but they considered Pharaoh a god. It'll not be that way when Joseph is in the land. Then the Middle Empire ran for about 1,700 years, from 2500 BC to 1750 BC. It was a feudal society during this time, ruled by local princes named nomes, and it ended with the invasion of what's called the Hyksos, which simply means the foreign empire. And this Hyksos people, that was a shepherd type people, introduced the horse and the chariot, which might indicate that they were Hittite in their nature. For the rest of the Bible and archaeology traces the chariot back to the Hittite Empire in Asia Minor. It's the north of the Mediterranean Sea. It was during this time that first of all Abraham, and then Joseph enters the land. And it'll be understandable then why they receive a warm welcome there, though they're shepherds, because the one sitting upon the throne was not an Egyptian, but was a foreigner who was himself from a shepherd nation and who had introduced into Egypt the horse and the chariot. That's going to be interesting, because Pharaoh is going to chase the Jews to the Red Sea in chariots driven by horses. During this time, the empire form of government, a pyramid form of government, took shape. where not Pharaoh didn't make decrees, and that was the word of God, but he would establish men under him that would carry out the will of he and his officials at court. That's why Joseph can be made the second in the empire, and there'd be third and fourth and fifth and sixth and on down people under him, because they established the kind of government that is popular today, the pyramid, the empire form of government. When Joseph dies, we're going to read in the book of Exodus, a new king arose that knew not Joseph. That doesn't mean a new man. That means a new kingdom. So the early empire was followed by the middle empire, that it then is followed by the new empire. That comes in about 750 BC and will be there to 570 BC. At the start of this period, the new empire, the native Egyptians expelled the Hyksos, the foreigner, and started a new order. During this time, matter of fact, we might even say exactly, 1446 BC, Israel came out of Egypt. Now, Egypt was harmed by that, greatly lowered by that, but they will continue a somewhat powerful empire until 570 BC, when they'll be annexed into the Persian Empire and then destroyed later, never to be strong again. Now, there are 6 major cities. This is, again, geography. There are 6 major cities I want us to think about. 5 of them in lower Egypt and 1 of them in upper Egypt. First of all is Memphis, which we've already located on the map for you. That's the ancient capital near modern Cairo. Heliopolis, called On in the Bible, which is just a little bit to the north and a little bit to the east of Memphis. Ramses, which is in the land of Goshen, either just east or just west of the easternmost tributary of the Nile. Pelusium, which you'll locate at the eastern mouth, and Alexandria, which you'll locate at the western mouth. Now, Alexandria will not be important until later, but it'll become the second metropolis of the world, second only to Rome. Now, down in Upper Egypt is the city of Thebes, as it's called today, called No, N-O, or No Ammon in the Bible. Ammon was one of the chief gods later, not at our time as we study Egypt, the Exodus, but later Ammon will become one of the great gods of Egypt. And No means a city. So here's the city, or the city of Ammon we'll find in the Bible. Between Egypt and the Promised Land is the land of wandering. You first go through what's called today the Sinaitic Peninsula. It has in it 2 major deserts, the wilderness of Shur and the wilderness of Paran. Israel will go through that desert, through those wildernesses, until they come to the Gulf of Aqaba, an arm of the Red Sea. And there they'll stand with the Egyptian army behind them and this impassable sea in front of them, and God will part that sea, and they'll go through on dry ground, and the water will come in and cover the Egyptian army. And there's archaeological proof of that, which we'll discuss as we study the Exodus. There is also then the land of Edom that they'll go through before they get to the Promised Land, and that's bounded by the Arabah and the Arabian Desert. It's a mountainous territory called Seir in the Bible, also called Edom, and there's where Esau's people will dwell. That's the geography that we'll see in the book of Exodus, in the book of Numbers, in the book of Deuteronomy. There are 3 chief cities that we need to have in Edom in our mind. Basra, which is the capital on the northern border just before you enter Promised Land. Sela, Petra, which is the most mountainous city known, and Ezion-Geber, which is the seaport at the northern end of the Gulf of the Gulf of Aqaba. That's a lot of geography, and that sometimes gets a little boring. So let's fit some history onto that geography. Turn to Exodus chapter 1, and we'll study today the oppression, the birth of Moses, the flight of Moses, and the call of Moses in the last 10 minutes of our lesson. In chapter 1, verse 6, he says, "Now Joseph," and the word "now" in the Hebrew is literally "and." It is as if the book of Exodus is just made a part of the book of Genesis. with this word and. As a matter of fact, the first 6 books of the Bible begin with the word and. That's why first 7 books. That's why sometimes the first 7 books of the Bible is called by the Hebrews the Heptateuch. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. What was the promise to Abraham? That his seed would become as numerous as the stars of the heavens. And God is beginning to fulfill that. Verse 8 says, then, and the Hebrew word is just and a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. That didn't mean he didn't know Joseph's name. It doesn't mean that he didn't know Joseph's history. It simply means that he didn't recognize the agreements and the covenants and the things that the old Pharaoh and the old empire had agreed to with Joseph and his people. Here was a new order that would not recognize the old treaties. Look at verse 9. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. What they don't know is they're just getting them in shape for 40 years in the wilderness. I mean, they've gotten soft in all these years of being fed, and Pharaoh's really putting them into an exercise program to get them in shape to take the journey to Promised Land. But the more they oppressed them, the more numerous they became and the more fruitful they became. Then Pharaoh made a decree that every male child of any Israelite was to be killed at the time of birth. And only the women, only the female children were to be preserved. He's trying to stamp out, or at least to slow down, the growth of Israel. Amram, a man, and Jochebed, his wife, had a boy. And he didn't want to kill the boy. So he said, the Pharaoh had said, throw the baby into the Nile. So Amram and Jochebed threw their baby into the Nile, but they put a boat under him first. They put an ark made of bulrush, and his sister Miriam watched it. And as it floated down the Nile, Pharaoh's daughter saw the ark and went and got it. She knew it to be a Hebrew child because it's wrapped in Hebrew clothing. But she took that child to be her own. And she was talking to her maids and said, but who will care for the child? And Miriam said, I know a lady. I know a lady who will care for the child. And his mother, Jochebed, was to care for Moses in the house of Pharaoh. And he grew up as Pharaoh's daughter's son, and as the grandson then of Pharaoh who ruled the world. Here's Pharaoh trying to stamp out Israel. And he comes in from a hard day, and he's killed a bunch of Israelites. He says, I'm tired from killing all those Israelites. Where's my grandson? I want to bounce him on my knee. And he's bouncing the boy that's going to carry Israel out of Egypt. Moses one day, when he was grown up, was walking along, and he saw an Egyptian afflicting an Israelite. So he killed the Egyptian and buried him. Days later, he saw one Israelite arguing with another Israelite and tried to get them to stop arguing. They said, who made you ruler over us? Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? And then he knew that Pharaoh would know. So he fled all the way to Mount Sinai in the land of Midian, just east of the Gulf of Aqaba. And there he served a man named Jethro, who gave him his daughter Zipporah to wife. And he kept sheep for another person while waiting for the call to go deliver Israel. He didn't know he was waiting for that call. He settled in. One day he's out keeping sheep, and he sees a burning bush. And he turns aside to see what this burning bush is. And God speaks to him out of this bush that burned but was not consumed. And he says, I want you to go back and deliver my people Israel from Egypt. And Moses began to make excuses in chapter 3:11 through 4 verse 17 of Exodus. The first one was, who, me? Who am I that I'd go deliver your people? The second objection was, who shall I tell them sent me? He said, you tell them the eternal one. You tell them you're not here on a time-based mission. You're on an eternal mission. He said, where's my authority? He said, you'll just throw down this rod, and it'll become a snake, and and that will show your authority is from me. Then he said, but Lord, I'm slow of speech. I don't know how to talk. He'd been debating with God here for all day long, and he says he doesn't know how to talk. These are excuses. These are not true. And finally, he gets to the bottom line, and he says, Lord, send someone else. I don't want to really go. And that made the Lord mad. And the Lord said, well, here comes Aaron, your brother. He'll go with you, and he will be the spokesman. I'll speak to you, you speak to him, he'll speak to the people. When they get back to Egypt, it starts out that way. But before long, Moses gets into the swing of things. And Moses becomes the debater with Pharaoh and the debater with the people that he was with God himself here. So here's a very quick survey of a long period of time. The people of God are oppressed at the death of Joseph. Moses is born. Moses begins to try to be the leader. Moses flees to Egypt, flees to Midian, flees Egypt to Midian. Moses is called by God from the mountain. And before long, this name will ring throughout all of Egypt, and today will ring throughout all of the brotherhood. Moses. Moses. We'll talk more about Moses next time.